Tell you what the book is about. Star.Ships is basically the story of the origins of the Western magical tradition. Now, a reasonable chunk of that journey has been very competently well told over the last maybe 15 or so years, essentially beginning in Alexandria in the end of the classical age, where you have a very polyglot environment pulling in Egyptian and Greek and Near Eastern ideas into magic in general, and from then on it sort of bounces around the Mediterranean and up through Europe, and we get the grimoire tradition and so on. The trouble is, I mean, Alexandria is one of the pivot points in Western civilization. It was essentially a late classical New York. It had about anywhere between 20 and 33% of the population were Jewish. You had Greeks, you had Romans, you had indigenous Egyptians, you had Africans, you had all these people there speaking different cultures, or different languages, and expressing different cultures in this sort of marketplace. So it's not a very good beginning point, because it's a place where ideas are combined rather than generated. And it seemed to me, kind of looking back, that the pieces that we built the magical tradition out of were exceedingly old by the time they showed up in Alexandria. So I sort of went looking for them. And that's basically the story of the book. As to how it came about, that's kind of a longer and almost polyglot journey as well. For someone who's, got a family that's maybe has been white and middle class for the last 200 years, in the last couple of generations we've had some fairly interesting sort of Pacific connections. I'm Australian originally, but on my father's side there's a very strong Pacific connection. So we kind of grew up going to the islands and hearing island stories, and my grandfather used to be part of colonial administration in Nauru and New Guinea. So, in fact, my aunt was born in New Guinea, so she's technically New Guinean. And these kind of stories were part of the childhood fairy tales that you tell. And I was always aware that there was a disconnect between how we looked at island Southeast Asia and what the indigenous stories there that were being told. So I kind of filed that away. And then, I mean, I'd always been a history nerd growing up, and I did a film degree majoring in documentary and cultural studies and that kind of stuff, and I've then went on to work for Discovery Channel and BBC Worldwide and so on. So that idea of about how we tell these stories kind of stuck with me. And these things kind of ran in parallel with a interest in magic that kind of blossomed at 13, and it was really off to the races from day one. Like, this is how I see the world and how I express my engagement with it. But it felt to me at the time that it was sort of parallel, and I could learn the backstory from this interest in ancient history. And about, I guess, maybe 5 or so years ago, before I began one of the more popular series on runesoup called The Whiskey Rant, it kind of occurred to me that I was in a very fortunate situation, and not a lot of other people had the context of, well, hang on, a lot of the stories that are told in Austronesian languages are essentially beat for beat the same stories we find in the Old Testament and the sort of cosmology of Old Kingdom Egypt. So I'm like, okay, I need to reconfigure this, and there's probably a story there. Enter the Scarlets. A couple of years ago, we were sort of talking about what maybe we could do and thrash the idea around. And it seemed to me that one of the things that might, from my own experience, improve other people's magic or their engagement with magic was additional context. So everyone, we're in broad agreement from Alexandria on, but for me personally, you get a much deeper engagement with particular spirits or particular performances of ritual magic when you realize that, in fact, they actually go back quite a way. So I went looking for how these pieces might, in fact, show up. And it turned out to be very well timed, because in the last 20 years, we've not only had, and even really in the last 5 or 6 years, we've not only had an improved archaeological understanding about how this works, but we've had an improved genetic understanding about how this works, and linguistic and anthropological and mythological. Academia has sort of come roaring out of its own administered collapse at the end of post-structuralism, where it became kind of racist and creepy to start to compare ideas or to suggest that some ideas might have moved from one area to another. I mean, in many cases they were correct. For much of the 20th century, that model of seeing how ideas moved was deployed for racist reasons. Like, it was, you know, smart people here moved ideas into places that people thought maybe were less smart. So the reaction about 40 years ago was to sort of step back and go, everyone independently invented everything, let's not have a further discussion. That's moronic. So it was probably a necessary step, because some things do move. I mean, we see this now, other things don't. So there are pieces in academia that I don't think they have successfully correlated the implications for. And that's largely because all the exciting things that happen for one field of academia happen next door to it. So for, let's say, anthropology, the interesting stuff is happening in geology. And for Egyptology, the interesting thing might be happening in consciousness studies or somewhere else. So they're actually not really set up in the way that we pull knowledge together to look at it in an interdisciplinary way. And the reality is that's what magicians do. That's what Alexandria was. That's what the Renaissance was. It was, I mean, when you think about the term Renaissance man, that is literally what it means. It means a person who can think and create in an interdisciplinary way. Unfortunately, I know there's some sort of creepy economics and, I guess, an unnecessary fixation with materialism that sort of prevented academia from pulling these pieces together in a coherent way. But it's 2016. That means if we actually do the spade work, metaphorically and in some cases literally, we can do that. There's actually no one there who has the there's no certificate for interdisciplinary skills. It is a learned behavior that we can all kind of bring to the table. So that was sort of going around in my head, and I'm like, okay, I guess that's what the book is about. It's about providing context and providing it in a way that is useful for people who are magically or spiritually operative. Because I actually have a tremendous amount of affection for, say, alternate history. In fact, in many ways, it was St. Patrick's Day. We should all be out there. I guess in many ways it was fingerprints of the gods who kind of made me realize in the early 90s that you can take academic information or take archaeological data points as you know, diligent science, but then provide your own interpretation, assuming it's a rational and balanced one based on the data. Because at the moment, academia can't do it. In a materialist sense, we're not very good at describing this story. And I actually don't think they're going to ever be that good at it. As I said, fortunately, this is kind of the job of the spiritual seeker. It's kind of the job to be the person that has these stories, the stories of our origins and our tribes. So that was kind of the stepping point into the book as to how it's done. And why I thought now is the time is that we've had this crash. So we've had all this amazing information that in the alternative field is only ever interpreted through the materialist paradigm. They haven't worked out that that's there. So we discover Göbekli Tepe, which kind of completely upends how we understand our hunter-gatherer ancestors and what they found important. And what they found important was culture and singing and essentially regular ritual activity that had something to do with the stars. And they did this. We built this before we were living in permanent housing, before we knew how to farm. We built a star temple on a hill. So that doesn't compute in a materialist paradigm. However, if you try to do an alternate version of that and you're still thinking like a materialist, you end up with aliens. You end up with physical UFOs coming to land. So it turns out that the trick there is to dismantle materialism and then look again at the information. Effectively, the story of the book is the story of mankind's journey for the last maybe 70 to 90,000 years. One of the things that is very promising, I think, in anthropology and folklore studies and mythology at the moment is kind of layering the information that we've gathered over the last 120 years with the movement of human populations out of Africa over the last 70 to 90,000 years, for which we can be quite confident. I actually, as part of this book, because I know there's quite a bit of consternation in the alternative world about the Out of Africa project. The science behind it is very good, as long as you know what it is saying and what it isn't saying. It's not saying where we came from, it's not saying how humans were made, or anything like that. The question marks remain around all of that stuff. What it is saying with, a high degree of confidence is the shape of human movement over the last 70 to 90,000 years. Now, when you look at that, and you look at the stories that we have told ourselves, and the most important stories, we're not just kind of making stuff up, but the stories that we have told ourselves over the last 70 to 90,000 years, and you match them to where we were, you start to get 2/3 of the way to a very interesting story. Because once you know that, the archaeological evidence that looks like Atlantis or looks like some sort of alien assistance, like physical alien assistance, starts to become, I think, even more interesting. So basically the first place we went, when we left Africa, we sort of walked out, turned right, and jogged along the beach, and ended up in island Southeast Asia very, very quickly. And then we stayed there for an absurd amount of time. Like, we're talking 20, 30,000 years before we moved into the northern parts of Australia and out into Melanesia. If you consider how old our civilization is, and depending on where you want to date it, do you want to date it to the fall of Rome, to the printing press? If we date it to, Jesus, they had 15 Jesuses. We've had one, the amount of time they've been there. And all of a sudden we're starting to find sort of shaped step pyramid hills like Gunung Padang, and the earliest examples of Paleolithic art are found in, which is stunning, by the way, is found in Indonesia and Melanesia. So we've got the people there. They've been there for a long time. We have the linguistic and genetic evidence to show they're there. And all of a sudden they're building pyramids and making this amazing art. And then that land sinks. That's interesting. The part of the world that lost the most land at the end of the Ice Age, an area of land twice the size of India, happened in island Southeast Asia, which was the area where we appear to be the most technologically and culturally complex when that event happened. So now you're starting to see where a lot of the stories that underpin the Western tradition, wisdom surviving from the end of the flood, the curious association between something like pyramids and that wisdom, you start to go, wait a minute, some of that kind of happened. And you then look again at the genetic information to show the sort of back crossing from island Southeast Asia into some very interesting spots like Northeast Africa, so Egypt, what is now the UAE, so areas around the edges of the Sumerian world, northeast into Turkey, obviously up the Indus Valley, and you start to get the pieces that support looking at the story of the flood and what it means. Again, the piece that I was waiting for, I think, for this book, and I've mentioned him on the podcast a few times, there's a Harvard Indologist by the name of Dr. Witzel, and he did a thing that you can only do at the end of your career, because he's quite old now, and he's been an Indologist for 40 years. And what he did was say, do you know what, I've been looking at this for decades, mythologies around the world. He did something extremely unfashionable, and he essentially family treed them, because you will find similarities around the world, separation of sort of sky and heaven by a parent god, warring brothers, the flood, all these pieces that you will find in South America, you will find throughout Eurasia, obviously, basically every beat of the Old Testament you can find kind of unevenly distributed around the planet. Now, when the alternative world looks at this, again we go with, oh, it must be aliens or it must be reptilians because everyone's telling the same story. That's not a very sophisticated reading of the data for a number of reasons. The main one being you're dealing with times that are literally thousands of years apart. So the cursory similarity between, say, the Inca or the Maya and Egypt probably isn't explained by the same alien event because you have a 3,000-year time gap. So that idea that they're telling the same story because it was a physical event that happened to them in situ is highly unlikely. What you can do is kind of family tree them together and then work out, well, when was the last time all these people who were the ancestors of, say, the South Americans and the North Africans and the Europeans and everyone. When was the last time they were all in the one spot? And that gets very interesting because you end up in this sort of southern Eurasian area at the 25 to 30,000 year ago mark, which is just as we're building step pyramids. And it's just as we're, or at least shaping hills into step pyramids and making this amazing art in caves in Indonesia. And so you have an opportunity to look at it and go, well, hang on. I think we've been telling this story for a long time, because if it survived the diaspora to South America and up through the rest of the world, then we actually have the legends that were told or the songs that were sung in these places that we now have the archaeological and genetic evidence for. And the songs they were singing, we'll put it this way, modern Magick has been singing classics for quite a while. So we've got some 20,000-year-old Frank Sinatra going on to do with essentially the journey from the ground up to the sky and back down, and that sort of shamanic up-down process, its association with the stars and the subsequent like power or the subsequent authenticity that comes from doing that when engaging with the spirit world in a wider way. So we're starting to see these patterns, and that ritual, one way or the other, is found in the Greek magical papyri. It's found throughout the grimoires. So when you crack open a grimoire that is, you know, definitively from the 1600s, but the shape of the rituals in there, assuming the sort of psychic identity of a particular sage from before the flood, and kind of aligning yourself with certain words of certain gods, that behavior, it would have been different languages and different gods, but that deep structure is extremely old, which is probably why during the sort of creation of the, well, shall we say the Hermetic period, it's probably why the Hermetic period actually happened. There is a sense of gathering up the silverware as you get into Alexandria with barbarians at the gate feel. As we know, the Hermetica has a lot of prophecies that people think are about the modern day. They're not. They're actually about the ending of Alexandria. But that's sort of beside the point. They're there trying to pull together the most amazing and important pieces. And the story they're telling themselves, which is the story that we've had brought into Magick, is that these are important and they're very old. And crucially, they're from before the flood. Now, biblical people refer to, which they were, well, a sizable chunk of them were at the time, biblical people will be talking about the flood from the Old Testament. The Old Testament flood is a very, very new version, comparatively, of a tumbled down flood story that they got through Babylonia and Samaria. And once you get to the Sumerians, you're essentially at that jumping off point where you're looking at these Eurasian cultures that we've just been describing. So in a funny way, they're kind of accidentally correct. They've used this story of a flood as their one sort of temporal measure. It's a before or after. It's quite binary. The good stuff, well, not all the good stuff, but a lot of the more profound stuff is associated with before the flood. And that's kind of the marker when you're looking at Magick today. Who are the sages from before the flood? What did they represent? So Hermes Trismegistus is the sort of storehouse idea of the sky-ground dualism and associating yourselves with certain asterisms and so on. And he was definitively understood to be before the flood. He also, I mean, this is all wrong, but he was also folklorically associated with the pyramids. So him and Agathos demon and a few other of the sort of Hermetic gods were either believed to have built the pyramids or were buried in them, or in some way associated with the pyramids. And what we can discern there when we look at it, I guess, with fresh eyes, is that folkloric association. It's not a literal reading of who is buried in the pyramids, because frankly, I don't think anyone was, at least where Giza is concerned. But you start to see that storehouse idea of how you contain the wisdom in folk tales and things that can be carried on during the diaspora. So that's effectively the route. That's the route through Star.Ships. That's the route the Star.Ship takes. Maybe I should have said that. The subtitle is A Prehistory of the Spirits. So we've covered the prehistory bit, because we use the word spirits. Well, grimoire magicians use the word spirits because it's a container term for a whole bunch of other stuff. We don't really use demons and angels because there are grimoires that are in use now that effectively predate the use of those terms. So spirits is cleaner because it covers gods and fairies and controlling angels and demons and Pokemon and whatever else is going on, right? And that's quite good because once you have that container term, you can see that they bubble around, and certain spirits, but not all, are probably modern survivals of very old gods and so on. So when the subtitle says a prehistory of the spirits, they're talking about a spectrum of phenomena that, I'm going to steal this from Dr. Jeff Kripal. These beings or entities are, so the spirits of the beings or entities behind the one-way mirror of physical reality. Backwards through history, you have fairies, you have the devil, you have all different words of describing some very, very odd and occasionally very real physical things. Missing time, spirit contact, inspiration, and so on. Now this is the kind of wider definition we need to turn and pivot and look at our new understanding of history that we've kind of arrived at through a sensible kind of sifting of the data. And that data is obviously the genetics, the linguistics, the geology, and so on. Realistically, alternate history is kind of running on a model of the world that is 30 or 40 years old. And a lot has happened in a number of different fields. A lot of very good work, some massively crap work, but a lot of very good work has happened. And we need to sort of absorb that and reset. And we need to reset for two reasons, which is the materialist assumption is definitively false as far as I'm concerned at this point after 120 years of consciousness research. It's just wrong. So if you're trying to look for this sort of building block materialist idea, you're in a fantasy land which you don't want to be in when you're talking about fairies and gods and spirits. You want to be a little bit more grounded. So that's kind of why we went with a prehistory of the spirits as the subtitle, because we're dealing with two different things here. We're looking again at the story of mankind's journey out of Africa and what that means for Western spiritual seekers now, and we're looking at who's on the other side of that, because you can describe a game, but without describing the players, and the spirits are clearly one of the teams that are in play in this story. In retrospect, yes. So Oscar Wilde said travel is only glamorous in retrospect. Writing is the same, because it's actually quite horrible. Especially when you're writing two books and you have a proper job. So you end up in this kind of, boo-hoo, it's the weekend and all the other kids are out playing and I have to do piano lessons. And there was an element of that. At its best day, it's the best thing in the world.
That's what I mean, but
yeah.
You know, you're enjoying what you're writing.
Oh, absolutely. The reason this book came out first is if that didn't happen, I would have ended up writing it in every other book. So this is a story because it's so intimately involved with my family identity and where I am in the world and how I approach Magick, that if I didn't tell this story first, it would have showed up in everything. I could have been writing, a technical document for your printer, and it would have showed up. So I needed to get this out. Yeah, it's a remarkable experience, especially when you're dealing with a Scarlet imprint book. And Peter and I, bless them, because I had the class. I didn't think I would, because I work in publishing, so I didn't think I would go through the cliched histrionic author journey that I did, including emailing him from New Zealand saying, why don't we just make the whole thing about Maori mythology? And he's like, no. I hate this is terrible, and kind of both of them gradually sort of pulling me back to it. So all those pieces, you think you're kind of smart enough to get around because you might be working in the biz. You don't, you have to go through them. And those are the bad bits, but the good bits, especially for a kid from like a coal mining town in Australia. I remember must have been maybe the second week of being in the British Library, photocopying and reading and so on. I just kind of turned around. I don't know if you've been to the sort of bottom humanities one room, but where you photocopy there, you can see out across the reading room. I just kind of looked at it while I was waiting for my card to be, because it's quite expensive, waiting for my card to be refilled. I said, I can't believe this is my life. I can't believe this is a thing that I get to do, because you sort of hear and so it's a tremendous amount of work, and it's a hugely valuable process. It is only glamorous in retrospect.
Would you draw any comparisons with Joseph Campbell? Your
Yeah.
modern Joseph Campbell?
I'm not. Dr. Witzel might be.
Right.
What's happened to... So as I kind of alluded to before, but comparing things, and this is in today's podcast, but comparison became really, really unfashionable because it had been historically used sometimes for some racist or sexist ideas of kind of looking, and really alarming stuff if you go back 125 years ago, like measuring how the weight, so you pour rice into an African skull, and you pour rice into like a Tibetan skull, and then you tip it out and weigh them. What the hell does that tell you? You know? With the benefit of 125 years later, we know it tells you nothing.
We've moved on.
Yeah. But what we did was we threw out a comparative method that is actually very useful, assuming you don't go into it in that kind of way. And so this is why I think Dr. Witzel's book is so important and actually really, really brave. So if you look at some of the sort of comments that other mythologists or Indologists have written about the book, they don't necessarily support him. They just say this is astonishing or this is groundbreaking. They don't say, well, this has changed my life, because they're kind of looking around and they're not really sure if this is the way it's going to go yet. And he did, because he's old and he's had a long and reasonably illustrious career, but he dropped the mic. He's like, you know what? These ideas are 20, 30,000 years old. We're pretending they're not for modern political reasons. And I think the world is hopefully in a place where we can start doing that, where we can start looking at comparison without it being creepy. Because one, it's kind of how the human brain is built. This is literally what we do. We compare things. Do I want to eat that or that? Have sex with that or that? In my case, those are the same things. And that skill has been kind of removed from the academy. And it's weird. So the pieces have come through out of sequence. So we have amazing geological and genetic and linguistic information available to us in the last 20 years, and archaeological. The piece that's missing now is kind of making a space to do comparison correctly again. And so in that respect, I do actually hope Witzel is a new Joseph Campbell, because he's not looking for an Ur myth. And in fact, the book is quite remarkable because he sort of lands at a 25 to 30,000 year old mark, and then looks at the stories that came before it, and then guesses by working backwards through the family tree. He sort of reconstructs what he thinks mankind's first spiritual belief system was at the sort of 250,000 year old mark. And he makes an extremely good case, which I won't spoil for you because I do recommend you go on that journey. But these are the things we can do. Oh, yeah. And he's quoted extensively. The Origins of the World's Mythologies. And the chapter in particular is Et in Laurasia Ego, where we kind of talk through the ideas, because I find, just as Joseph Campbell was for magicians, Witzel is extremely important if you're in the sort of magic game, because it provides you this context and repositioning for ideas and practices that we have maybe put on the wrong shelf. One of the sort of unacknowledged lines of research in the book was effectively trapping academics or scientists, or stealing their pets and texting them and saying, answer my questions and you get your pets back. Not quite that, but academia is absurd as a group. Individually, it's not. Individually, if you get them and you kind of have off-the-record discussions, they're very open to the ideas, but I was also very open to get the real thing, because the official story, particularly when you get to Egypt, is just, it's moronic. Like, a child could do a better job of how we describe dynastic Egypt. So, in that respect, there are a few places that are kind of under the radar. I've had some reach outs from a couple of different sort of anthropology and mythology departments already. So I don't know. I'm going to promote the book, I guess, amongst people who are probably spiritually inclined. So just to say this, we're in a world, if you do your own research, and it's expensive, like it does help to have the British Library a tube right away. But if you do your own research, we don't need their permission anymore. Like, the thing that's going away, and that's their fault. They've kind of doubled down on this hyper-political, materialist cult of $300 texts and speaking to each other in gobbledygook. I mean, academia has returned to its medieval church origins, basically, as a group. Individually, they aren't, and you kind of realize that. So we don't really need their permission. I don't think there needs to be. Put it this way: it will never be on a syllabus for Egyptology or something. It will be for maybe mythology or comparative religion. But I consider them more our allies anyway, because they're sort of secretly open to it. But I don't think, one, I don't think we need to change their minds. Two, I don't think we can. So it's really for people. It's part of your magical or spiritual journey. When you're interested, go as far as you want to go.
Does that, the sort of time scale, does that put Enoch in Southeast Asia?
Do you know, funnily enough, kinda. Not necessarily as a real person. So especially when you're dealing with biblical archaeology, like from about the 70s, we sort of knew that Moses wasn't a real person as much as he was a mytheme. So you have that lawgiver type that is probably about 20,000 years old. Frankly, he may have been a real person 20,000 years ago, but he wasn't in the biblical timescales.
Interestingly, there's also an artifact in the British Library which shows a ramming thicket that predates Abraham by thousands of years.
There you go. Do you know where? And the sheep is Indian, and it was originally domesticated in India, and it shows up in Africa thousands of years before the pre-dynastic period. And in the book, you have a lot of there is a lot of sort of physical evidence that can't be ignored. Like a sheep or cucumber can't be ignored. You can't fake that. It's not like, oh, I misinterpreted the sheep. That's where they came from, and that's how long they've been there for. So the short answer is yes. A lot of these stories to do with domestication. So, for instance, Cain and Abel, I'm reasonably confident, is the story of the culture clash between the new farmers and the old hunter-gatherers, because obviously one of them is the kind of growing guy and the other one is the hunting guy. And that story is huge. There are hundreds of different warring brother stories in the Pacific, particularly in Melanesia, which suggests in that kind of Humpty Dumpty sense that the original version of that happened in Southeast Asia at a 20 to 30,000 year mark, because we have, just like with genetics, where you have the highest concentration of variations, like mutations. It's the sort of deepest time depth. So, kind of, yes, with Enoch, but more interestingly with the Enoch story is obviously the Watchers and the kind of leftover spirit beings that we get in the biblical world. Now, as part of our journey out of Africa, the place where we encountered the most near-human hominins was island Southeast Asia. So you have Homo fiorensis, you have the Denisovans, and not only that, the highest genetic admixture between human and sort of near-human hominin occurs in island Southeast Asia, which means the laying with the daughters of man happened there, and not only that, with the Neanderthals, well, it happened everywhere, but the sexy times were longer and deeper in island Southeast Asia. But we actually got big chunks of the sequence that is associated with our immune system from that event, particularly from the Neanderthals. So I'm not saying that the Watchers are a memory of the Neanderthals, because I think they actually belong in the spirit camp that I was talking about before. I think they're a description of a range of things that happen behind the one-made mirror. But I'll be damned if I don't think that the sort of cultural memory of that interspecies sort of Lord of the Rings time isn't encoded there, because it was. And actually, with each passing year, I don't know if you've seen any of the Denisovan jewelry. Like I did this, like I have some, but but it's stunning. And it's the same with the sort of Neanderthal grave sites, especially for kids. There's a very famous one of a juvenile Neanderthal with sort of bear skulls and the remains of flowers, and you think those parents had a really bad day when that kid was put in a cave. And you suddenly realize they weren't just lumbering animals there, raping the women and accidentally giving them an immune system. We were in a world where we had physical cousins who we may have engaged with in some quite profound ways, including sexual ways. And where that happened the most, at least as far as the sort of out of Africa journey is concerned, currently is in a kind of chunk of island Southeast Asia that is now majority underwater. Funny how that works. It's for people who are willing to read it more than once. So, like, it can be the first sort of occult book you read. I'm very sorry if that's the case, but thank you for buying it. Please do read it again 20 books hence. So it kind of comes in different ways. There is no, I mean, this is a very, and I get this and I'm completely behind it, there's no sort of spell section at the back of it. It's not that kind of book. A sort of broader Scarlet Imprint mission is to, I'm just going to put words in their mouth because they did technically say I could talk about them, so I'm going to, is to provide context to existing practice. We sort of, I think it's a hangover from the 70s, but we have this need when a new idea shows up to kind of flip the altar and like, now I'm this, and now these are our gods, and it's not how this stuff works. And indeed the point, particularly when it comes to grimoire magic, is that whilst the form and some of the spirits, quite a number of them frankly, we can probably trace them back 20,000 years ago, that doesn't mean you try and find out what, you don't rehypothecate an Austronesian language and try to find out what Astaroth was called then and try to get that to work. You just realize that she has been part of the human journey for millennia and approach it in that way. Some pieces have, like actually tracking down the Astaroth stuff has, because that's been a part of my practice for a while. But to answer your, like, to give the chaos magic answer, which I've given a few times before, but I'm going to stand by. Older doesn't necessarily mean better. We find that in the modern world and so on. But oldest might actually be better. And I'm not saying this is the oldest, nor like, congratulations, I've discovered the origin of magic. That's not the case at all. But it is part of that sort of quest, because even though we can be very confident with our genetic information about the little monkeys moving around the world for the last 70 or 90,000 years, you go back 2 million years and it's messed up again, and we have no idea where that stuff came from. We have no idea what the first few stories were. Dr. Witzel thinks one of them is a civilizing trickster, and particularly one that either came and sort of went back up into the stars or not. He thinks that is one of the cornerstone, very, very oldest ideas at the 250,000 year mark. So we don't know where humans came from, and don't let anyone tell you we do. And the earliest and most competent sort of rehypothecation of our first belief system is a civilizing trickster. And the trickster is obviously a very broad term to describe the unreliability of these phenomena that we refer to as the spirits. So for me, I think that remains. And actually, Mircea Eliade said in the last century that every creation myth is a culture trying to deal with self-awareness, trying to actually answer the consciousness question, like, why do I have internal thoughts and the cat not so much? Why, again, not so much. There's probably cat lovers in the room. So those are the pieces that I think we need to go in the next step. For me, for people who are kind of interested in pushing magic forward, or at least deepening its context, this is the beginning rather than the end. This is like, let's throw some ideas out there, thrash them around. I actually kind of used Dr. Witzel as the template for that, because his big, ambitious, messy book, mine's not that messy, but he definitely said multiple times through it, look, this is day one of thinking about these things this way, so a lot of this stuff is going to not bear out with time, but we have to go in that direction. And that's kind of the sort of idea here. We need to start throwing in the best of anthropology and mythology into magic, see which bits work with it, see which bits don't. But for me, I kind of alluded to at the beginning, I've always had that context. So since I was a kid, I had that sort of alternate or ancient history thing running alongside the practice of magic. And there's something very odd, even just with sigil magic, where, and this is in the intro, even the practice of the most modern magic you could think of in the practice of it, feels immensely ancient. It feels like the first thing any human ever did. And I've kind of been chasing as to why that is for about 20 years, and this is where I got to.
Do you think the tricksters are the soul operative?
Don't know. I think the word is unreliable. When I deploy trickster, which I do as a word in blog posts or in discussions or what have you, I kind of use it as the spirit, but a particular end of the spectrum. I'm not convinced. I can guarantee you it's not a single archetype. But when we refer to the trickster, we're sort of dealing with that really weird end of the spirit spectrum that abducts people for no reason and brings them back covered in flowers 2 weeks later. And what the hell, And it's at that end. So, and again, I want to start getting people to think in that spectrum sense, because you can go up from there and you can get to, sort of the spirits with a creepy sense of humor that is halfway there, so like gay day spirits, and you move up. And if we start to think about it as a phenomenological spectrum, I think we're in a very good step one to reconsider how they have interacted with us through the human journey, which they definitively have. But I don't think the best explanation, in fact it's close to the worst, is little green men in spaceships coming down telling us to build piles of pointy rocks.
Don't you think that body experience? Or
Yeah, well,
somebody,
that's still an
somebody has to
origin.
be
So,
adept.
and funnily enough, when you actually deal with, in Dr. Witzel's lexicon, we have the Laurasian myths, of which our kind of myths are that. But the earlier ones, and they're still extant around the world, he calls the Gondwana myths, which is a incomplete. So the Laurasians is a single storyline. But if you look at, say, Australian Aboriginal creation stories, they are like that. They don't have the same kind of breath upon the water, creation of light, emanation thing. We got kind of really into that metaphysics about 20,000 years ago. But if you look at our earliest versions of it, it almost is that natural, spontaneous arising. But that's still, to go back to Mircea Eliade, that's still telling the story about how it happened. It's just that now we have a very kind of Baroque, high-budget Netflix version of it now. But the first ones probably weren't that. They were, as you say, like, a space toad vomited us up. Why? Who cares? That's what happened. Like, and because it is that when you kind of, I don't want to use the word psychically, but when you draw your attention to that origin point, to that rise of self-awareness the very first time, it does look quite weird like that. It does look less like, a high-budget production and more odd, more tricksterish, which I suspect is why he's correct, that the sort of earliest civilizing God at that point is the most unreliable, or the least reliable. I wouldn't ever do that, but I would probably look at providing additional context for the pieces within the existing grimoire tradition that I think match it best. So I'm not... Put it this way, I think we have enough grimoires we should... Like my mother used to say, you're not even using the ones you've got. But it's a good point. Like there is an opportunity to kind of essentially do an index of the most popular ones and say, well, this kind of conforms to these ideas here and there, but not necessarily a completely rehypothecated one on its own.